We are back with Professor Wazir Mohamed. Those of you who are joining us for the first time, I'm Selwyn Collins, your host of CWS Conversations with Selwyn. Professor Mohamed, before the break, the question I ask is, why is understanding indentureship and post-emancipation so important to the discussion on racial divisions in Guyana?
Well, the first point I want to make in relationship to that is that there is a conception that East Indians saved the sugar industry. There is no truth in that. East Indians indentureship was employed as a labor control mechanism to discipline the African workforce. It is not that the African workforce abandoned the sugar industry. The African workforce were not allowed to work in the sugar industry because they refused to work at the same, based on the bad labor conditions that East Indian indentured labor was forced to work under. African labor always wanted to work in sugar. And in fact, I've come across conversations in the history in the National Archives where in the African villages in the late 1870s and early 1880s, they were having conversations among themselves and they're saying, maybe we should ask to be indentured because we can't get jobs. So that's the first point. The second point, indentureship was important because the price of sugar had to be kept cheap so that Guyana could compete with sugar being produced by slave labor, especially in Cuba in the 19th century. That is why the second slavery is important. What's happening in Cuba is important to understand the condition of African labor and what happens in Guyana. There is a number of issues that needs to be explored in relationship to the history of Guyana. The other point I want to make is that there is this confusion that the rice industry was established by the East Indians after the 1860s. What happened after the 1860s is that some East Indian indentured servants were able to get permission to plant rice on the margins of the sugar plantations because then they could feed themselves. One important point that we need to understand is that the African population, while enslaved, always wanted to plant rice so that they could feed themselves. But they were debarred from doing so. So, the African population was the first population to plant rice in Guyana. In fact, there is an Alvin Thompson deals with this in one of his writings, in which he's talking about an 1832 raid in a village, in a runaway slave community behind Maikoni, in which the militia captain found a house with enough rice in it that could have fed 700 men for, I can't remember what period, I think it was for about a year. So the African population wanted to plant rice, but they were debarred. While the East Indian indentured servants were given minimal permission to plant some rice on the sugar plantation after the 1860s. The rice industry itself did not really get established until after the sugar crisis, the world sugar crisis of the 1880s. So the rice industry began to be constructed into an industry in the 1890s. And it could only have been constructed as an industry in the 1890s after the land laws, which were passed in 1839 and 1860, were relaxed. In 1839, the colonial government, in the fear that the African population would move off the coastal plain, decided to pass a law that says that they could only acquire parcels of land in 100-acre parcels off the coastal plain, that's off the Krung Dam, behind the Krung Dam. Of course, the African population at that time could not afford that. And then in 1860, they then made an addition to that law where they said that the price per acre for land at that stage beyond the Krung Dam would be $10 an acre. And again, the African population could not afford to buy any land beyond the Krung Dam. In the wake of the world sugar crisis of the 1880s, the colonial government found that they were in crisis. The planter class could not pay the return passage, they had a glut of East Indian labor on the plantations. They had to find something to do with them. In the context of that, the land laws were relaxed in 1897, and that people were able to buy land off the Krung Dam in the riverine areas at 15 and 25 cents per acre. It is in that context that East Indians were able to acquire land away from the villages and from the coastal plain, and so the rice industry got established. One point that we need to understand, that between 1850 and 1900, the villages were becoming multiracial, because East Indians who were free of indenture were moving into the villages. And so in the 1960s, what you had were multiracial villages. And so a lot of the riots, a large part of the riots in the 1960s was the moving out from large East Indian villages of Africans who were living in these villages and East Indians who were living in African villages. We tend not to understand that history, that up to the 1960s, that almost all the villages had a multiracial content in it, in which there were Africans living in predominantly East Indian villages, and there were East Indians living in predominantly African villages.
You know, let me go to the chat room and read a few statements. Balaram Dani said, very revealing. Wish I had better internet service to really get all of it. And our country is crying for positive change. And Peter said, this is so revealing. Thanks, Professor.
Balaram Dani, I know Balaram Dani.
You know Balaram Dani.
Balaram Dani is an exile from Guyana. He lives in the Bahamas. He was part of the Democratic Teachers Movement in the 1970s. He was a teacher at Anna Regina Multilateral School. He comes from a village on the Essequibo Coast, Affiance. And, you know, that is one of the villages that Alan Adamson did his research, because that was an original African village. African people lived in that village. So, I mean, you know, there's a lot of history behind where Balaram Dani comes from.
So, do you think this racial divide, and which resulted in some historic disadvantage for the Africans and so on, you think this was deliberate, Professor?
Well, it was deliberate in the sense, I don't think the racial divide itself was deliberate. I think the racial divide evolved, and the racial culture evolved out of that. Mm-hmm. What was deliberate is the imposition of indentureship to ensure that Guyana was competitive, that the colonial state, that the colonial authorities, that the colonial planter class could have competed on the global sugar market. Now, Guyana could have taken a different route. Guyana could have taken the route of Jamaica and other places, and could have allowed the African villages to develop an independent existence. I mean, remember, one of the most important points about that history is the fact that the first time that a group in the population outside of the planter class was able to develop a crop with export capability was the Indian population. The African population never had that access to develop a crop, an export crop, so that they could hold on to something and build resources around themselves. There's a lot of talk about the Africans going into the gold fields in the 1880s and after the 1880s. But in what circumstances and in what capacity did the African population go into the gold fields? They did not go into the gold fields as owners of land. They went into the gold fields as workers to work with those people who owned land. They went in as pork knockers.
You in a published article in the book The Second Slavery,
Mm-hmm.
which I find is a very provocative title actually. Under the heading Peasant or Proletarian,
Mm-hmm.
you argued that the former slaves of Guyana
Mm-hmm.
have been mischaracterized in the main body of literature and writings dealing with post emancipation period, and that the writings sought to shape the understanding of ex-slaves having constituted themselves as peasantry.
Mm-hmm.
If this were deliberate, and judging from the evolution of the class and racial divisions in Guyana, what do you believe the perpetrators had to gain from such a position, and why?
I don't think it was deliberate.
Okay.
I don't think it was deliberate. I mean, Walter Rodney, in quoting Elsa Govaya, one of the Caribbean's noted historians,
Mm-hmm.
said in a presentation he made at Binghamton University in 1978. He said the problem with history and the history of Guyana and the history of the Caribbean is the fact that these people who are writing based on from the point of view, from the class point of view of the planter class. That they're not basing their writings or their understanding of history from the point of view of the working people. And so that is why I went back to study the 19th century, because I wanted to understand what Walter Rodney was talking about, to understand the condition of life, and to be able to recapture the history from the point of view of the toilers, of the working people. Because if the people are going to free themselves from these hang-ups that we have that has produced the racial culture and the struggle over economic and political resources, then they have to understand that history. They have to understand that history evolved and was produced by the economic structure,
Mm-hmm.
by the economic and political structure. There was no. I don't happen to think that there was a conspiracy. Race evolved, and because race evolved and because the racial culture evolved, what we have to do is that we have to engage in discussion and we have to engage in education. We have to engage in education. We have to let our young people at the elementary level, beginning at the elementary level, to be able to piece together this history, to understand this history. We have to teach this history to them. And we cannot teach the history from the point of view of the planter class or the point of view of the ruling class. And that's the point. That's the basis of Walter Rodney's writings.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the basis of Walter Rodney's politics.
What do you believe is the conversation, or I'm sure we're having some discussion about the racial division, but what do you believe is missing from your experience and your exposure? What do you believe is missing from that discussion?
What I believe is missing from the discussion is the people. Is people's empowerment.
Mm-hmm.
Is the development of a structure of a social process that deliberately helps people to begin to have conversations with each other. I mean, how many young people of East Indian descent or of African descent try to understand each other? If they understand each other, why do we still have a problem in communities if an East Indian girl wants to date a black boy, or a black girl wants to date an East Indian man? Why are they still ostracized in their own community?
Mm-hmm.
Because we have not gotten past. We now have conversations about each other's humanity. We have accepted. We operate on the basis of the structure which was handed down to us, of the superiority of those whose skin color is closest to whiteness, and that those whose skin color is closest to blackness are inferior to those whose skin color are closest to whiteness, and that is the structure that produces that we reproduce in our education system.
I want to shift a little bit to you. you went into teaching.
Mhm.
What actually led you to that profession?
Well, I mean, this for me it was an accident. I mean, I was a young man. I had just graduated from University of Guyana in the late 1980s. I could not get a job in Guyana.
Mm-hmm.
I was doing farming on the side. I was doing 100 different things at the same time. I was married. I had children. And then the rice industry was globalized. I mean, the Grains Jamaica Limited um, got established. The PL480 program, the US PL480 program, began to dump US PL480 rice on the Caribbean, which took out of contention 35% of the Guyana's crop. And so Guyana lost 35% of its market, which was the Jamaican market. And so the entire rice industry went into a tailspin. As a result of that, as a small rice farmer, I lost my entire crop. I lost all my investment because a rice miller decided that he was going to take my crop and abscond out of the country. I don't even know where he is today.
Wow.
And so I began to look for other avenues on how I could deal with taking care of my kids, taking care of my children. So it was not a plan to become a teacher. I then won a scholarship to come out and to do graduate studies. And then when I got to graduate school, professors at the graduate school said, "But Wazir, why aren't you not doing a Ph.D.?" And then that is how I ended up doing a Ph.D. And then, one thing led to the next. And then during the years, because of my experience, my lived experience, it was easy for me to be able to get an adjunct position in Binghamton University. And so by the time I became a professor, I had already developed a dozen of my own classes. And so I had become a seasoned teacher while I was still in graduate school.
So what is most gratifying to you about teaching, and how does it feel when a student gets your lesson?
What is most gratifying to me about teaching is that I could use my experience to teach students on how to develop a common humanity. And so I have students who I taught at Binghamton who are still following me. In fact, I have a student who just graduated with an MPH. He sent me a picture the other day. And, in a class he took with me on the sociology of race, I was able to teach him about the equality of all human beings.
Mm-hmm.
And it was kind of dumbfounding for him. It was a life-changing event for him. And this was a white student. And he immediately decided that he was going to go and volunteer in Louisiana after the hurricane to address some of the problems faced there by people of color. And then after that, he became a member, he became a Peace Corps volunteer. He ended up in the Cameroons, where he did community work for several years in African villages to take health care and to African villages. So I have students like that. That is gratifying. When you have students like that whose lives you have changed, you have made an impact on their life because of the classes that you teach. One of the things that I like is the fact that I teach the classes that I like to teach. I teach classes in which I could address the question of racial inequality, of economic inequality, of gender inequality, of inequality based on sexual orientation. I teach these kinds of classes, and I enjoy doing that.
Can you tell us about your first lecture and what it was like, and if you ever felt like quitting?
You always feel like quitting. I mean, because you're, look, the world is becoming one place.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there is no, the basic structural differences between Guyana and, let us say, the United States. But the condition of work is no different in most of these places, the conditions of life, people face some of the same issues and the same problem because of the way in which capital now controls the motion in whichever place you are in the world. Big companies and capital controls the decision-making processes. So when we're talking, and we have to understand that we now live in a new dimension in a global world. I would love to teach classes in which Guyanese students can take online class, and I teach online too. But I mean, you asked me about my first lecture. I really cannot remember my first lecture because it was so many years ago in Binghamton. I think it was teaching in the Education Opportunity Program at Binghamton University, where I was given the opportunity to become an instructor in the Education Opportunity Program, where universities offer scholarships to people of color, to young people of color from the inner cities to come to the university if they can show that they meet the standards. And so for 6 or 7 years, every summer while I was in Binghamton, I was given 15 students of color to work with and then make recommendation to the university on whether they should be accepted or not. I really enjoyed those conversations and teaching those students because, I mean, in a certain sense, I have similar experience. I came from the same kind of social and economic background as them. And so they could have, one of the gratifying thing about teaching is when students can mesh with me after they've met me for the first time. And, you know, where I teach now, you know, most of the students come from very rural farming communities. And so we can develop a rapport and a relationship.
Peter asked in the chat room, are you hopeful for the end of racial division in Guyana?
We have to be hopeful. We have to be hopeful. I mean, I don't think that it is something that can be legislated. I think that, as I said, it have to come through cultural and educational intervention, through conversations, through people meeting each other, through people understanding each other. The political process must play a role, yes. Civil society has to play a role, but I don't think that there is any one single answer to these problems. I mean, the world. I mean, look at what is happening in the Ukraine now. Look at the number of racial conflagration that has occurred since 1990. There have been more racial wars in the world since 1990 than ever before in the history of the world. So ethnic warfare and people disrespecting each other, it's a global problem. Guyana is not unique. The racial problem in Guyana is not unique. Sometimes Guyanese tend to feel that the problems that we suffer is unique. Yes, there are some specificities to the problems that we have, but our racial problem is not unique. I mean, race is more intense where we are here in the United States.
That is very true.
Yes? I mean, if you want to know what the racial problem is, I mean, come and live in the United States.
What is one thing about you most people do not know that might surprise them?
That's a hard question for me to answer.
Okay.
Because I don't know. I don't know what would surprise people. I think the most important thing about me is my non-racial nature.
Yeah.
The fact is that I feel uncomfortable when I am only in the company of one racial group. It makes me uncomfortable. I am most comfortable when I'm in the company of combination of groups in which people can learn from each other. I feel uncomfortable in situations where people stereotype I don't stereotype. I don't engage in stereotyping of anybody. I think one of the important things about me is the fact that I believe in complete respect for all humanity, of all human beings, that you do not disrespect a human being because of how they look, how they speak, their language, their culture, etc., unless they approve themselves differently.
Yes.
That we must always live a life based on respect for one another. And so everything that I do, all my engagements with the Christian churches, my engagements with Muslim groups, and I am a member of the Muslim Youth League in Guyana. I do lectures in Guyana every time I go home. I participate in leadership training in the mosque, in the Muslim community in Guyana when I'm in Guyana. I always give of myself and will always give of myself.
I like that.
Because I think that is what all of us need to do. My PhD is not mine, because it comes from all the experiences that I have gained from the relationships that I have had over the years of my existence in Guyana. It comes from the fact that I know Balram Dani from the Essequibo Coast, yes, who is my friend, that I know David Hines and UC Guyana from Buxton, who are my friends. There is no difference in my friendship with Guyana than with my friendship with an East Indian like Baram Dani or Rupert Rupnarayan. That is important about me. And if all Guyanese, would take a leaf out of my history, Guyana will be a better place.
Well said. As you mentioned, Balram Dani, I wanted to say this to him. You're having some problems with your internet connections where you are, but we are transmitting in three different bit rates.
Oh, I see.
Roll your mouse over I'm sorry I didn't say this before, but roll your mouse at the bottom of the video player. You will see an option to select a lower frequency, 360, I think, and see if that works.
I don't know how you do that.
Not you, Professor.
Balram Dani.
Yes, that would be Balram Dani or anybody in Guyana or Africa or so on.
Right.
Bibi in the chat room said, I grew up with black people in Supanam, Essequibo Coast, and we never encountered any racialness. The people were...
Supanam is a multiracial community.
She said the people were respected, they respected us, but you were not allowed to date any other race, but hanging out was okay.
I know her family also.
Interesting.
Because, the thing about me, Selwyn, is that I know people in almost every village on the coastland. Wow. You see, in 1985, I organized and was in charge of a long walk when Burnham had denied us the opportunity. He had denied us the right to march. And so we decided that we needed to get our message out. And so we decided to walk the country from one end to the next. And my task was to mobilize each village to receive the walk. So we had a walk-in relay, 7 people walking across the country for 17 days.
Wow.
And so I had developed linkages in every single village across the coastland.
What have you learned about yourself from that experience, Professor?
What I've learned about myself, I surprise myself all the time about the possibilities for innovation.
I like that. Who are some leaders that you admire and respect?
Look, I admire all leaders. I mean, look, I met Burnham in 1973. I was 15 years old.
Mm-hmm.
My parents was in the opposition. Burnham came on the Meet People tour after the 1973 elections. And I went out to see him, yes? And I can remember embracing Burnham in 1973. Burnham had his own kind of quality. I also admire Dr. Jagan. I mean, you have to admire these guys for their tenacity.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. I also admire Dr. Jagan. Hoyt had his own personality. We had our differences. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
But I know these guys. Walter Rodney was the person that I had the most admiration for. Yes. But I have fond memories of all these leaders. I grew up in the same time period as most of the people in leadership in Guyana today. So I know most of the people on first name basis.
I'm curious about something, or you in relation to that period with Dr. Rodney.
Mm-hmm.
As you listen to him as a young man,
Uh-huh.
in the 70s, we were all there. I was a young man in high school at the time. Do you remember any particular? Do you remember any particular moment or period when a transformation started to happen, take place within you about your view or your perspective on Guyana, your
Well,
perspective on who you are as a Guyanese? Do you
I
remember?
mean, I think 1979 could have been that moment
Mm-hmm.
when I was involved in there was this solidarity movement which I was involved in, and between bauxite and sugar workers to bring bauxite workers and sugar workers in conversations with each other. You see, I was involved in a lot of stuff like that. On one week, we would bring down a group of bauxite workers and take them to a specific sugar estate and have them sit down in a house and converse with sugar workers. And then the following week, we would take a group of sugar workers up to Linden and have them converse with bauxite workers. And I saw that gelling of mind and consciousness that we are all alike. Yes?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think the transformation was the development of solidarity between those two groups. That when the bauxite workers went on strike, the sugar workers went on strike in solidarity with them. And then we were able to and then I was involved in a movement in Georgetown to get the commercial workers, the clerks, people working in Georgetown, to come out in solidarity with bauxite and sugar workers, which we did successfully. That was a transformatory period, 1979, early 1980. And basically, it is because of that transformation Walter Rodney was killed.
I am tempted to give you a class to lecture, and I'm going to create this class.
Right.
I believe I am a student or a product of education in the 70s. Queen's College, then Bishop, 74, 75 co-education. And I maintain that our education system was fine-tuned by the mid-70s. And we were taught by some of the greatest minds,
Of
young and
course.
greatest minds that Guyana had to offer.
Of course.
I also maintain that Guyana did not really get a good return on her investment educationally wise.
Yeah, because you see, remember in the 1970s, late 1970s, what happened? Burnham decided that he was going to dismiss teachers who did not support the PNC. So people like Sister Hazel Campaign, who was at St. Rose's, lost her job. A great teacher, she now lives in Canada. Yes?
Mm-hmm.
And Dai, who was Sandra Williams, who was teaching at Charlestown Secondary, lost her job. You see? Bonita Harris, these are great teachers. They lost their job because they did not see eye to eye with Burnham. There is this Brenda Doe Harris. She now lives in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, she was my teacher, one of my
These are all
teachers at
African
Bishop's.
people, African women.
But I
Lost their jobs.
let me finish creating this class for you because I'm curious to see what you would say. You are in this standing at the podium, and you're standing in front of a group of us who, you know, were in high school in the 70s.
Right.
We migrated.
Right.
Most of us do not quite understand our history or know our history in the context in which you frame them in some of your um, articles and so on. But here we are, willing and ready to do something for our country. What would you tell us?
I would tell you that what we need is to set up study circles to study the history in the villages. You have to go back to each village, and we got to bring people together and have them sit down and read history aloud. Read Walter Rodney aloud. Read the history of the Guyanese working people aloud. And then discuss it. Look, the history is right there in the villages, you see?
Mm-hmm.
You have all these elderly people who are in their 80s and 90s. We need to interview those people and capture that oral history. We're losing that.
Yes, I agree. Worthy task.
Yes, we're losing that, but we can't. I don't have the resources, nor do you.
Right.
But each of us could do this in our own little way.
I think you and I have started something here tonight.
When I went home to do research in 2007, and I went to number 51 village on the quarantine. And I wanted to ask questions of people as to the number of Africans who are now farming in the village. And that started a conversation because, then they were able to begin to look. Sometimes people cannot see the stuff that is right in front of them unless you have conversations about it.
And the right questions. How do you balance all the demands of teaching and school with being a father and a husband?
Well, the most important, I've always decided that the thing that comes first in my life has always been my family.
Mm-hmm.
My family has always been my number one priority. Everything else comes second to my family. Right now, I'm preparing for my son to go off to college. For me, that's the number one priority in my life right now.
Yes.
So family must come first. The other things will have to take second place. Even my studies took second place to my family when I was in graduate school.
Mm-hmm. Looking back, what will you change about your education, your experiences? Would you change anything?
No, because I have lived a full life.
Mm-hmm.
A life that with a varied experience in which I was always active in defense of people. Whether I was involved in Islamic activism in the mosque, mm-hmm. as a member of the Muslim youth organization, I was always struggling to ensure that there were conversations that change the discussion so that we can have respect for each other. If I was involved in cricket at the community level, we did the same thing. If I was involved politically, we did the same thing. I was never involved in any process in which I was creating a situation where one person or one group would have undue advantage over another group or another person.
You spoke about your mother early on, and the question you asked her about the villages next door. Mm-hmm. What story does your mother always tell about you?
Well, about me?
Yes, about you.
That's, you have me there because it's hard for me to. I tell stories mostly about my parents.
Right.
I can't recall her telling stories about me. I know that my parents have enormous respect for me,
mm-hmm.
And I have enormous respect for them.
Right.
One of the most important thing about my mother, which I should share, is the fact that when Walter Rodney was killed, my brother, the one before me, he was in hospital because He was tortured by the Guyanese police force, and he had a broken chest bone. And I was surprised when I looked over the crowd following Walter Rodney's body. There was my mother in the middle of that crowd.
Wow.
Having a son in the hospital for following Walter Rodney, and there she was in the middle of that crowd, marching behind the body of Walter Rodney. Now, that speaks volumes about the quality of the person who is my mother.
Yes. Thanks for sharing that. That's a loud imagery, I must say. In your opinion, how has social media changed the way you teach?
Social media is important. I don't think that students, young people, really value the importance of social media. This is why young people use social media in what I would say in a frivolous way. They would not think that it is that. About, I'm having a cup of coffee, or I'm sitting down at some place, or this is my hairstyle. All that is good. And people need to share that information. But young people need to get involved in asking questions, in discussion, in conversation. And young people are not using social media in conversation so that they could learn something and build consciousness. And I try to use social media in teaching, and will continue to expand my use of social media in teaching. But it is hard to get young people to understand that social media has a larger value, and that they could really create their own independence and a space for themselves by blogging, by putting their ideas and views out there, by engaging with other people, by trying to debate. I mean, take for instance, somebody wrote on Facebook the other day that President Jacob Zuma in South Africa, is going to make the speech of his life. And I wrote back and I said, he has made the speech of his life long before. He made the speech of his life, and his life is now decided by the fact that he's supposed to be leading a movement of the working people, but in his cabinet are not millionaires but billionaires, and that his government was involved in shooting workers. So what other speech can he make? I have not had one response.
When are you most happy, Professor?
When I'm most happy is when people engage. When I could feel the engagement. When I could feel people's passion through their engagement. That is when I'm most happy.
Before I ask your next question, could you give us a glimpse of that book, the Second Slavery, please? And is it available for purchase?
I think it's available. It should be available on Amazon and on Barnes and Noble. It should be available online.
Okay.
If they type in the search engine, the Second Slavery, Mass Slaveries and Modernity in the Americas and in the Atlantic Basin.
Thank you.
It should be online. And then the other book that I have, which I have an article which discusses the limits of Western democracy in relationship to Guyana, is Social Justice, Poverty, and Race.
Social Justice, Poverty, and Race. That's also on Amazon?
Yes.
Okay.
And I have a book chapter in there.
What would you say is gratifying about being Wazir Mohamed?
What is gratifying about being Wazir Mohamed is this person who belong to several different networks in which I could converse with people in South Africa or in England or in Sweden or in Guyana, in which I could pick up the phone and call somebody in any part of the world because they've touched me and I've touched them.
Wow.
Through the number of movements I've been involved in.
Wow. I like that. I can just imagine that web of relationships That is powerful. Wow. What are you most proud of?
I am most proud of the fact that I have I have given part of my life to Guyana to help to bring about to enlarge the conversations towards change.
What?
That I have given, I mean, one of my, I mean, when I left high school in 1975,
Uh-huh.
I decided that I was not going to go to university until Guyana became free. And so I did not enroll at the University of Guyana until 1992. In point of fact, it was the day immediately following the 1992 elections that I went to the University of Guyana and enrolled. So, I mean, I'm proud of the fact that I have given of myself and will continue to give of myself to others.
What's next for you, Professor?
I don't know. I mean, I don't. I tell my students that I am not your run-of-the-mill professor. Being a professor is not my profession. It is my profession for now.
I like it.
Because I would like to do community development work, which is what I'm most passionate about. I would like to help communities begin these conversations wherever those communities are. Whether they're in Africa, whether they're in Asia, whether they're in the Caribbean, whether they're in Guyana. Because we live in a global world.
I agree with
the problems are virtually the same wherever we go.
If you could go back in time, what would you tell that 14-year-old boy, Wazir Mohamed?
I would tell him to do it all over again. Because I don't regret any part of my growing up and any part of what I did. I am thankful to my cousins. I'm thankful to all the people who have influenced me, because I am not who I am without them. I cannot be who I am without my colleagues, my colleagues in the trade union movement, my colleagues in the Islamic movement, my colleagues in the political movement. You see?
If you and
furthermore, my colleagues in the WPA family, in the family that have an idea about a different future for the country.
Two more questions. This one here, you're in a room at a round table with Dr. Rodney, Dr. Jagan, and Forbes Barnum. What would you say?
Well, it would be hard to say anything because you would be overpowered by those guys.
And I forgot one more.
Like
one more. Dr. Williams, Eric Williams.
Yes, if you're in a room. I mean, with Dr. Williams, I would, if I had a conversation with him, I would question some of his premise.
Okay.
As I questioned in my dissertation.
Yes.
Because we still have to have those conversations because he is involved in creating the dimension that I wrote about. If I was able to have a discussion with Walter Rodney, I would be able to have a discussion about his understanding of the history that I'm talking about. And I would try to get him to enlighten Mr. Barnum and Dr. Jagan about that history.
And my last question, which I ask every guest, what makes you laugh out loud?
What makes me laugh out loud?
Yes.
When I understand my children. When I understand. When I understand them. You know? And I would laugh to myself sometimes while I'm driving, and my wife would say, "Why are you laughing?" And I would say, "Nothing."
That's a good note. That's a very good note. And Professor, it has been a pleasure. Thank you so very much.
Thanks, Elvin. I hope that this was rewarding, and I hope that our paths will cross
Yes,
again.
of course. Of course.
Small world.
Yes. I'm looking forward to another conversation at some point. And I really have to read or finish reading your your piece in the book, the article in the books,
Yes, well, I'm hoping to
second
have my
slavery.
book out sometime next year,
Okay. Okay.
in which I'm bringing all these pieces together.
Oh.
You see, I'm hoping to have my book. I mean, it's already 5 chapters already finished, and I have another 3 chapters to finish. So I'm hoping to have that out sometime next year.
Well, once again, thank you so very much.
Yeah, thank you for having me, man.
All right. Good night.
All right, good night.